Fantastic. Ooh, it's good to see you and
It is,
everyone.
it's good to be back in our July webinar.
Absolutely. We had a little bit of a break, and I had really hoped that we would be in a much better place in terms of the pandemic itself, but alas, we are not.
We are not
So Octavia becomes more and more relevant still every day.
every day. I think we're
Absolutely.
still in disbelief.
Yeah, actually, even with her guidance, even though she tried to tell us, or as I love how Toshi Regan said, no, she did tell us. She didn't try. She told us.
We just didn't listen. Although Toshi listened, she got the go bag and everything.
Yeah, Toshi list.
So I know people are still coming in. I can see people joining us, but should we go ahead and get started?
Sure, sure.
And welcome to Octavia Tried to Tell Us webinar number 6. And hosted by myself and Tananarive Due. And we are excited today because we have two great guests with us. And one of the things we get a lot of questions about, even from previous webinars that we couldn't get to, was about the theme of teaching parable and teaching Octavia. So we said, let's do an entire webinar about teaching Octavia. And Tananarive and I have both taught Octavia, and we grabbed two excellent scholars to talk about teaching Octavia as well. So I know that our Dr. Clay Coleman, our public scholarship technology consultant, is here.
On the job right there.
And he will help us get started.
Alrighty, welcome, everyone. Welcome to Octavia Tried to Tell Us, this 6th installment, as Dr. Coleman mentioned, of the parable for today's pandemic. This webinar is hosted by Tananarive Due and Dr. Monica A. Coleman, with special guests Dr. Farah, Jasmine, Griffin, and Dr. Moya Bailey. Before I get into introductions for our esteemed guests and hosts, I thought it made sense to give us a plan for our time together. So we'll start with introductions, as I mentioned before. After that, we'll move to the conversation. And the conversation will be interdispersed with some of the questions that you shared in that web form that you submitted. So our panelists will address some of the questions that you've submitted there as well. I'd also like to remind you to go ahead and use our hashtag Octavia Tried, our social media hashtag on Twitter. You can join the conversation there. It's been going on since the first webinar, and it's been some really interesting discussion. You can follow along that way and ask your questions in that space too, or engage with any of the responses that folk like to present in that community space. But first, I would like to introduce Tananarive Due. Tananarive Due is an award-winning author who teaches Black horror and Afrofuturism at UCLA. She is an executive producer on Shudder's groundbreaking documentary horror noir, A History of Black Horror. A leading voice in Black speculative fiction for more than 20 years, Due has won an American Book Award, an NAACP Image Award, and a British Fantasy Award. And her writing has been included in Best of the Year anthologies. One of them is actually sitting on my desk right now. Her books include Ghost Summer Stories, My Soul to Keep, and The Good House. She and her late mother, civil rights activist Patricia Stephens Due, co-authored Freedom in the Family, a mother-daughter memoir of the fight for civil rights. She is married to author Stephen Barnes, who was also one of the esteemed guests for an earlier edition of this webinar, with whom she collaborates on screenplays. They live with their son, Jason, and 2 cats. You can get in touch with Tananarive Due and follow her on Twitter at Tananarive Due. Next, I want to introduce Dr. Monica A. Coleman. Dr. Coleman is Professor of Africana Studies at the University of Delaware, my alma mater. She is also an ordained elder, in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She works at the intersection of faith, culture, and social justice. She's the author and editor of 6 books and several articles and book chapters that focus on the role of faith in addressing critical social and philosophical issues. Her book, Making a Way Out of No Way, A Womanist Theology, is required reading at colleges and universities around the country. Her memoir, Bipolar Faith, A Black Woman's Journey with Faith and Depression, received the Silver Illumination Award in 2017. Dr. Coleman speaks widely on religion and sexuality, on religious pluralism, churches and social media, mental health, and sexual and domestic violence. You can reach or follow Dr. Monica Coleman at Monica A. Coleman on Twitter. Next, I'd love to introduce Dr. Farah Jasmine Griffin. Dr. Farah Jasmine Griffin is the inaugural chair of the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department and the William B. Ransford Professor of English and Comparative Literature. She's the author or co-author of several books, including Who Set You Flowing, which is on my bookshelf for real, The African American Migration Narrative,
Did we lose? Oh, we might have lost sound from Dr. Coleman.
Yeah, I don't hear it anymore either.
Can you hear me?
Oh, now we do.
Now we can hear you.
There you
Sorry
are.
about that. Technology's gonna do what it's gonna do. But we're gonna work our way through it, and that's okay. Sorry about that, Dr. Griffin. Dr. Griffin collaborated with composer, pianist Jerry Allen and director, actor S. Empatha Merkson on two theatrical projects for which she wrote the book. The first, Jerry Allen and Friends celebrate the great jazz women of the Apollo with Liz Wright, Diane Reeves, Terry Lynn Carrington, and others. Premiered on the main stage of the Apollo Theater in May of 2013. Octavia did say that we need singers, and those are some great ones, let me tell you. The second, A Conversation with Mary Lou, featuring vocalist Carmen Lundy, premiered at Harlem Stage in March 2014, and was performed at the John F. Kennedy Center in May of 2016. Last, but certainly not least, is Dr. Moya Bailey, who was in my dissertation. This is a beautiful thing for me, I kid you not. Moya Bailey is an assistant professor of Africana Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Northwestern University. Bailey's work focuses on marginalized groups' use of digital media to promote social justice as acts of self-affirmation and health promotion. She's interested in how race, gender, and sexuality are represented in media and medicine. She will spend the upcoming academic year at MIT as a Martin Luther King Jr. visiting scholar in the programs of women and gender studies. Congratulations, Dr. Bailey. Her co-authored book, #Activism, besides also being on my shelf, Networks of Race and Gender Studies, is a wonderful read. I most certainly recommend it. It was just released in 2020. She currently curates the Transform DH Tumblr initiative in digital humanities and is the founder and conspirator of Quirky Black Girls, a network for strange and different Black girls. She also serves as a digital alchemist for the Octavia E. Butler Legacy Network. Dr. Bailey is well known for coining the term misogynoir to describe the anti-Black racist misogyny that Black women experience. So without further ado, I will cede this space and open it up for the conversation around Parable for Today's Pandemic. Please do remember to use that hashtag on Twitter to join in the conversation.
So hello.
Hello.
Everyone.
And for quick clarification too, I got two things wrong in the bios. Dr. Griffin is at Columbia University. I gave you all these great titles, forgot to tell you where you could find her. And Dr. Bailey is at Northeastern, not Northwestern.
Oh, I was about to say, go on.
I'm from Michigan, so my fingers just automatically went to the Midwest.
No worries.
But I know you're at Northeastern, so our apologies.
So fantastic. Well, thank you for that, Dr. Coleman. Thank you for all of you who are here. I see some people are already tweeting on the Octavia Tried hashtag, and let's just embrace for a moment how important it is for us to all have a space to come and share, because I think sometimes we're not okay, actually, and it's okay not to be okay, but it's important for us to meet with each other and talk about those subjects that give us strength and inspiration. And I know for all of us, Octavia Butler is definitely one of those subjects. So I'm so happy that both Dr. Bailey and Dr. Griffin can be here. And I hope it's okay if I now call you Moya and Farah.
Please do, yeah.
And we've got great questions, but I know we've all taught Octavia Butler. We've taught parable. So maybe just start off with how we've taught it, in what context, and what was meaningful about it.
Well, I'm planning to let the guests run, so I will shut up after I just say this really briefly. But this is so at the top of my mind because the last physical place I went in a crowd before lockdown was at UCLA's presentation of the Parable of the Sower opera. And classes were maybe even still in session or just about to end. And then we moved to the all virtual quarter for the winter quarter, which is my Afrofuturism quarter. And we were virtual for the first time. Everyone is scattered. Everyone is in this state of insecurity. And that's the quarter when I was teaching Parable of the Sower in my Afrofuturism class. And I actually felt sort of bad about it because students were already going through so much. And I know it can be a difficult novel emotionally. My own experience with it was having to read it a little bit at a time. And that was during what felt like much happier times compared to now. So I have to commend my students for the way they rose emotionally to the occasion. They not only were able to get through it, but really appreciate it. And a lot of them addressed Octavia's work in their final essays. So I know it had a great impact on them. But I'm also curious about what other experiences have been.
Well, I taught it before in a survey, an African American literature survey course, and I usually, interestingly enough, teach it after I teach Beloved, or I teach it before Beloved, or but I try to pair them, kind of this one looking back and this one looking forward. And it actually was not on the syllabus for this year's survey. I switched that syllabus up a lot because there's so much to choose from. And it wasn't originally on the syllabus. And then, we got notice that we were going online. And then we got notice that we weren't coming offline. We weren't going to be back in class. And I changed the syllabus at just switched it up and took some things off, and I added parable. And so it's interesting hearing Tananarive say that she sort of felt sorry that she had it when the pandemic hit, but I chose it because the pandemic hit. And I just wanted to read it slowly with my students. I changed the syllabus, so we spent 4 classes, I think, on parable. And I thought that it would be a good way to get them and me thinking about what we were going through, and also thinking, realizing that this brilliant woman had already imagined it, So it was a moment of improvisation on a syllabus that landed her on my syllabus this year.
I think it's so interesting that it was so timely that we, even perhaps not realizing it, that text has such an important history and legacy that it's always relevant. So I assigned it for a feminist futures class that I taught last fall, and it was my first time teaching it. So the students were learning different aspects of a feminist future. So in one of the texts, we read Parable of the Sower, but then we also read Bloodchild and the text in there. And for the final project, the students wrote their own short stories. And one of the things that they said was that Octavia's writing was so useful to read because they got an opportunity to think about what is the purpose, what's the narrative that they're trying to share, spending a little bit less time on the details. Not that Octavia doesn't give us wonderful details, but they really got from her work the power and importance of the story. And that was something that was really impactful for them. And now, of course, in the spring, I have students from that class emailing and saying, oh my goodness, Dr. Bailey, look at the world that we're in right now. All of this has come to pass.
Yeah, I've taught parable in theology classes because I'm a theology professor, right? So I've taught it in either a constructive theology class or a class I call Theology for Social Justice, both of which are teaching students how to do theology, so to say. And it's interesting. I've taught it in Illinois, and I've taught it in Chicago area, and I taught it in California. Of course, it's so much more poignant when you live in California and you really know what it's like. You have this idea in your head of walking up the Phi. But I think for both contexts, the reason I teach it is because it's such an amazing example of how to look around you and think about religion. See what you've inherited, see if you like it or not, put some new things together. And this is actually how theologians do theology. But I love it because it's this teenage Black girl doing it, right? This teenage Black girl with hyper empathy syndrome doing it. It's not the old German white dude in a cabin somewhere in the 19th century, which is this, so it's, I mean, I love what she's saying, and I'm all about, Earthseed, but it's also just, this is how we do theology. We walk our way through it. We look around and observe and put things together and tell other people and talk with them and get their ideas about it. And it's such a great way in some ways of thinking about thinking religiously. But I've had some of the same experiences, former students I've seen on Facebook saying, oh my God, what do we do? No one prepared us for this in seminary. I was like, if you took my class, you know what to do. And they said, yes, actually. That it wasn't a required course at every school I taught, but to say parable did give us an idea of what to do.
I love this notion you bring up, Monica, of the teenage Black girl as the leader in the story, the one who's the visionary, the one who is the planner, the one who has to buck tradition and buck the fears of people around her to try to prepare them. Because that's so appropriate, even in this Black Lives Matter era, in addition to the pandemic. How many young people do have to step up to do what I'd call, for my students, real world building. And I think that's where my students got their inspiration from Parable of the Sower, because it's very frightening, of course, to read this near future dystopia that not only feels like now, but even in the world of the novel, we're shambling closer and closer to the year where the novel takes place. But the empowerment of both the religion of Earthseed and the leadership model, I think, really do help inspire students to believe what I think we all have to believe on one level, is that we can make a difference. And I think also understanding that Octavia very much wrote this novel in an effort to try to make a difference. There's nothing Octavia just wrote was like, oh, okay, here's a scary scenario. What do you think of this? It was all, no, we need to change. We need to change course. We need to take a closer look at how we're interacting with each other. And we need to stop the inevitable, which is what, unfortunately, she always saw as where we're headed right now, that our human nature would lead to our destruction.
Yeah, I think, wow, you said so much that resonates. And, the fact that she has this young woman who is, I always say to my students, she's a prodigy, right? She's gifted. She has this sight and she's visionary, and she also has the strength and the energy and the will to build and to move forward, to create community. And that it's a novel about building a new world on top of an old one, that really world building, like what are we going to eat? How are we going to interact with each other? What are going to be our ethics? Just to engage in that process of imagination as a political process, as a spiritual process. And it's being led by this teenage Black girl is really, there's nothing else like it, except the moment we're living in, where we're being led by teenage Black girls. So.
Yes. And that to me is also the strength of our movements too, being led by young people, both traditionally and contemporarily, as Tananarive was saying. I just think for my students, that has also been something that I've tried to remind them of. Lauren is 15 at the start of the novel, just a few years younger than some of you, and she's able to find this fortitude and continue with these dreams and ideas for a new world, and trying to get in them that sense that they can create that too, that there is that there's still possibility. There is, I think now we can see it a lot more clearly, but before, when we saw things as perhaps more static before COVID-19, sometimes my students would talk in ways that made it seem like the world was always the way it was and that things are not capable of changing. And the novel does such a great job of showing how things just snowball and things can move very quickly. And so we're seeing that now in this COVID-19 world. It's much more real to them that things that we take for granted can suddenly shift. But there's so much in our current world that tries to keep us from thinking like that. And so the text, I think, for them is such a wonderful entryway into the potential for change and transformation.
So that's the inspirational piece, and the inspirational piece, of course, is huge with the Earthseed parables, and which, as I mentioned in this webinar before, really helped me get through election day back in 2016, like trying to make sense, and even returning to it now. Oh, the only lasting truth is change. It's like, okay, right, that's right. You have to expect this. We have to expect the unexpected. But I'm wondering what parts of the novel your students struggle with, or are there parts your students struggle with? I always expect pushback at the notion that God is change in ways that I really haven't experienced thus far, but I think more so it's the violence in the novel that some of my students struggle with, especially the attack, on her community, which is rendered. She wasn't present, but the aftermath alone tells such a gruesome story of murder and rape. And, I'm just wondering what experiences you have had with students struggling with it, and what you did about it.
I think my students struggle with the violence, definitely, and it changes. I mean, it's interesting. This year, there were some questions around her relationship at the end of the novel. And I've never had that before, but they were like, he's old, he's like her father, that's so weird. And it just took, I love teaching young people because they shake me out of my comfort zone. And I'm like, what? I wasn't even thinking about that. We're talking about something else. What are you talking about? So it was, that was something that surprised me, that they just, they were really, many of them were really taken aback. And what does it mean to be involved with someone who you say reminds you of your father? And so that was different. The extent of the violence, I think, always raises the question about when is violence necessary? Can we ever be in a place where violence is not a mechanism that we use against each other? And is this world on the other side of this going to be a world where people are safe from that kind of violence? I think you're right. That's something that I've heard time and time again.
Similarly, my students did not like that she ended up with Bankole. They really did not like that. They too were struggling with that age difference. And I think particularly in the context of talking about them as being just a few years older than Lauren. So for them, it didn't seem right. And of course, this is a theme that we see throughout Octavia's text, these really, drastic age differences between characters who, yes, fledgling, of course, where characters are together. And for me, I think it really invites them to think about, why do they have that protectiveness around Lauren? Because I do think that on the one hand, we have to think about how childhood and teenagehood have been constructed in this American moment versus how we might think of teenagers or children very differently in another context, and definitely in the context of the world building Octavia is doing. But then at the same time, we have all of these instances of people being very predatory on children and young people. So I think that's one of the things that going forward, I want to tease out more when I teach it again, because for students, it is asking a question of what are the new relationship dynamics that we want in the world that we're building? Is it enough just to say, well, we choose each other? And so, yeah, I think that is, I don't know what the word is, interested and tickled to see that your students were struggling with that too, Farah.
Yeah, I think it's a conversation you and I, all of us need to have about the pedagogy around that, because I had not thought about it before.
Absolutely.
And it's funny, I've been teaching graduate students, right? What really gets them is Earthseed, right? Not the content of it as much as, so she just made up her own scripture. I'm like, yeah. And they're like, you can't do that. I'm like, sure you can. So like, what do you think writers are doing? But it's jarring because, it's easy to have these you think of scripture as being old and ancient and written, coming out of the mouth of God, right? And dripping through the fingers of a prophet who's long been gone. That the idea that we write scripture now is really a hard thing. And then that it's a litmus test for getting down with the movement, right? Like if you're not down with Earthseed, you cannot walk with us, right? And she's like, so let me run it by you before you get comfortable here. And I'm like, faith communities do that all the time. Like it's not really a new thing, but I think it's jarring to see and to people be reminded of, you mean I can't escape? I can't be safe? I can't go with you if I'm not okay with your scripture? I'm like, yes, that's what people do in faith communities. So I think that's always jarring that they just can't believe that she just writes a scripture, which I think is jarring in the ways I hope it's jarring. I like it to be jarring. And it really pushes us to think about what points us toward God, right? Is it only certain kinds of texts, or is there a broader canon?
Oh, Monica, that reminds me of, go ahead, Farah.
No, go ahead, Moya. Go ahead.
I was going to say, your comments really make me think about the difference between cults and religion, because that is something that came up with my students too. What makes something a religion versus what makes something a cult? Also, what's the slippery slope between a cult and a commune? Like, to what degree is this, limiting people's individuality in such a way that it is coercive in some way? I mean, especially when we get to Parable of the Talents, these questions really come up because it's, is this just your idea of religion, or are there incentives or ways that people are being forced to participate in ways that are not entirely of their own free will? So as much as I love Earthseed, when we get to the end of Parable of the Talents, I think she's also asking us to think about what is that difference between religion and cult. And I've also heard something that, the difference between a cult and religion is time. Cults are new and nascent, and religion has the history and longevity that cults do not.
I mean, it's so interesting, and thinking about what Monica said, what I say to I said, first of all, she's a writer, right? And she's working it out, right? Like she in some ways, like writers do, she's like, by writing it, she's figuring it out. Let me try this, let me put this down. What do you think of this? And I always, I think Moya's right too, where I think about, well, how would you have felt about Jesus just kind of roaming around, picking up those disciples, like how did people look at them? What were they considered at the beginning stages before they were creating something called Christianity, right? Like, how do we live and what is God? And how does the God we create serve to make sense of the world that we're in, right? And in so many ways, that's what she's doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. My husband, Stephen Barnes, and I had a conversation that we recorded with Octavia in the year 2000, where she talked about creating Earthseed as sort of the solution. Another, after, say, Dawn, where the aliens were supposed to be the solution, had its own shortcomings. You know, if you've read Dawn, which is her real science fiction, biological science fiction, but also she's sort of reimagining that question of, is there some sort of intervention that can shake us from our current path? So in Dawn, it was the aliens. In Parable of the Sower, it's this religion, which is so powerful. The Earthseed parables are so powerful, but of course it's ironic in the sense that Butler herself had moved, like Lauren Olamina, had moved away from the religion of her father, which was Christianity. Her father is a minister. So on the one hand, she had sort of moved away from the religion she was raised in, but she still understood the power of religion to help create change, which I just find fascinating.
And in some ways, right, she's even saying, I'm not creating it, I'm just noting it. Like, this is already happening. This is, you see this in her notes too, right? That I'm just writing down what I see. I'm just observing. I didn't even have to create it in that sense. But she understands how religions work, because, right, in anthropology, religion, everything's a cult. Well, like Christianity is a cult, like everything is a cult, right? In a kind of anthropological term, but it's such a slippery slope, because just as you say, the same way that things we call cults start are the same way religions start. Like, what's the difference? And it is, and I don't know, I'm not a cult scholar in that sense to talk about what happens, but it's so very similar, right? Things that we would think of as being legitimate and fine, if you just use different words, sound just like something we delegitimize, right, and would condemn. And yeah, again, in Parable of Talents, we see how that gets really slippery, which I think is helpful to help us think about, right? Because part of what Butler is doing is trying to show us, like, where things can go wrong, right? So where things can get out of control. And we see both kind of the beauty of religion and the danger of it.
Yes. So did we want to move to some of the questions that we have from our visitors to the panel?
Yeah, how about the music one? We have a great question about if we've taught Octavia Butler with music, in hip hop in particular, but have we used music in our teaching of Octavia Butler?
I love that. Well, of course, the first thing I have to say is I wish the Parable of the Sower opera were just readily available for me to have on repeat. I would be playing it every morning. I would be playing it every morning during my morning walk. I have a morning ritual, and it's just so beautiful. But from a hip hop perspective, some of the artists that I teach in my Afrofuturism class that I think would accompany Octavia pretty well. Kendrick Lamar, I think, would go very well with Octavia's work. Janelle Monáe would go very well with Octavia's work. Dirty Computer. That if you haven't seen it, you need to check it out. It's free on YouTube. But absolutely, those are part of the soundtrack of the world of Octavia.
Yes, I teach Janelle Monáe when I teach Octavia, and particularly Janelle Monáe's own articulation of her love for Octavia Butler, I think is a good thing for students to think about. Like, who are artists drawing on? Who do they understand to be their contemporaries? And I think there's a recent, Interview magazine did a cover story with Janelle Monáe, and she's reading Wild Seed in the picture. And then earlier, there was the artist Khalees, who has another kind of famous picture of her reading Bloodchild during one of her interviews as well. So I do think that there's a way that Octavia's work is filtering into Black feminist artists thinking about their work and how they understand their craft as not just in one area, but being influenced by writers. And that's what I love too about Afrofuturism, is that it's not just one type of artist medium, that people are moving through all of those different genres.
Yeah, I in the past I've taught it alongside, referencing Janelle Monáe. This year I didn't have a soundtrack with it, but I gave my students their final project was a creative response to anything we'd read, and a large number of them chose Octavia Butler, and they could have chosen anything. And interestingly enough, a couple of the visual artists drew things inspired by Earthseed with acorn and just worlds inside the acorn, and the musicians, quite a few of the musicians chose to create songs musically and lyrically inspired by Earthseed and inspired by Parable of the Sower, and very different kind of genres, like from jazz to like electronic. I mean, all different kinds of music that it was really wonderful. Yeah.
That is so cool. And you just get to like enjoy it as you're grading, right? I mean, it must feel like a lot of fun.
Sorry. I was just going to say I was peeking ahead at one of the questions, and since we were talking about religion, one of the questions is asking whether we do need that component. Octavia felt that it was necessary in her art to create this religion to help propel movement forward. And one of the registrants was asking, do we need that when we're creating movement? There's a lot of attention on movement spaces right now. It's very important that those spaces move efficiently, So I'm just curious about what you think about that question.
Well,
I'm doing the easy part. I'm asking.
I'm always going to say yes. Yeah, Moya, go ahead, please.
Oh, I was going to say there's been a lot of talk about millennials and our, interest in African diasporic religions and kind of moving away from Christianity and returning to some more traditional practices. And I definitely see that in the organizing I'm a part of, because I think what's drawing people to those practices is the deep intention with which people are thinking about healing in those traditions, which I think we are realizing we need more and more of. And for a lot of us, Christianity has been a source of pain, perhaps, depending on our traditions, and the fact that a lot of us are queer, trans, somewhere on that spectrum, not next to straight or next to cis. So for those of us who are still hungry for religion, I think some of these more traditional practices seem to have more room and have always perhaps carried more space for those things in terms of how Christianity has been morphed in this evangelical moment that we're seeing in the US. So I've been really, heartened by the way people are turning towards those traditions, and even some things that are not necessarily religion, but are religious adjacent, like astrology, crystals, like all of that, I think is very much a part of how people in my generation and younger are trying to make sense of what are some of the ways that we want to relate to each other differently, and where do we see that happening in society and in different modes.
I was like literally gonna say the same thing, just less elegantly. And so I feel like, radical social movements always need spirituality, right? Do they need Christianity? Not necessarily, but and for some reason, in many cases, explicitly no. Does that bother churches? In hindsight, of course. When they look back, like, we were part of that movement, like, no, you weren't, right? But I think that we always need a spirituality, right? Even the things that you talk about is like religion adjacent, right? Astrology, et cetera. They're all divination, which is to me, religion, right? They're all ways in which we seek to access, our power beyond ourselves. And that's a big component of what religious folk do. And so I do think, because we have to have something that holds us together, and, meaning even an individual holds us like together inside, keeps us from falling apart, keeps us from being completely discouraged. I think that's where the hope comes from for so many people, or at least what sustains hope.
Yeah, I think that, I think back to an earlier generation of Black feminists, someone like Toni Cade Bambara, who said that, we lose it when we stop attending to the spirit, right? When movement doesn't make room and space for people's spirits to be cared for and nurtured and acknowledged. And, if you think about a book like The Salt Eaters, that's kind of what it's all about, right? And then really having to have a kind of spiritual healing that draws upon, different forms of spirituality. And so I would say, yes, it's like what Octavia told us and what Toni Cade Bambara was telling us and showing us. It's part of a kind of Black feminist continuum that says, if you're going to have a movement, you have to attend to spirit and people's spirits.
And that comes back to the music piece too. And I really do look forward to the time when more people can hear the Parable of the Sower opera that Toshi Regan and her mother, Bernice Johnson Regan, composed. It's just so soul-filling. And as I think of my own mother, who was in movement spaces in the 1960s, those freedom songs were like spirituals, were like hymns for her. Yeah. Those were the songs that lifted us, and that we literally sang as she was passing, and feeding the spirit was very much a part of what gave those young people courage. And I think we need to absolutely remember that as we're demanding so much of young people who are out on the streets, subjected to state violence. Yes, that the spirit must be fed.
In fact, it's funny you mention that, because, if I do teach a music that goes with Earthseed, at least, it's the music of Sweet Honey in the Rock, right? That's the music I sing to my daughter. That's what's in our home, because it's spirit, but it's also our culture, right? And I think that's so much of what you're saying, Moya, right, too. And with the example of Salt Eaters, right? It's that mixture, right, of spirit that feels so deeply rooted in our cultural experiences that heals us.
This is a different topic, but looking ahead to the questions, I see one that really jumped out at me, since we are talking about movement and activism, and so often we forget that the heart of Black Lives Matter is about policing and police brutality and stop killing us. We're getting everything but that in response. Right. But one of the questions was whether there were similarities between the police in our world and in Parable of the Sower. And for those of you who read it, you may remember that largely policing is off screen, but when it emerges, you have to pay for an investigation, and they come with a lot of skepticism. There is literally no sense throughout this novel that the police are protecting you. In fact, they're largely irrelevant. So I wonder about that. It does feel a lot, actually, like our future model of policing, because right now, police are just ubiquitous. I mean, almost no matter what kind of community you live in, and I live in a pretty quiet suburban community, the police presence is, you might see 3 or 4 police cars driving your son to school back when we used to do that. And I often wondered why so many police, but we've just, and it's, now we know, I mean, it's over budgeted, it's this sort of thing, but in years to come, policing will become more sidelined. It is going to take a different shape. And I was wondering what the panel thinks about this question of policing, or if anyone had any thoughts.
One of the things that strikes me in the novel, you're right, it's kind of sidelined. It's also privatized in interesting ways, right? And the feeling that the private security forces in certain places are better. But really are not better about protecting you or making you safer. Like it's, the question becomes, what are they better at? And so I think that the novel gives us a chance to raise questions about policing and the role of policing. And especially in the context where I think Butler is warning us, preparing us for the kind of privatization of all these public services anyway, that are about protecting a kind of corporate community, right? More so than protecting citizens. And I think the novel also asks those questions, like, what is a citizen? Like, what are you a citizen of, right? And what's the relationship between policing and citizenship? So,
absolutely. And I'm thinking particularly of the company town, Olivar, that is that place where people feel protected or think that that's the solution, and not realizing that anytime that you're going into this enclosed space, that there's always the potential for other people to come in and disrupt, which ends up happening to Lauren's community. So I think it really invites us to do away with the idea that you're somehow protected by the police or by people who are in positions of authority. Mm-hmm. It's so much more about the day-to-day relations that people create with each other that ends up being the thing that is going to sustain or help you when there's a crisis and when there's a situation that you are not prepared for. So one of the things that I really like about kind of the early part of the novel is Lauren talking about the people who are in the cul-de-sac community behind the gate that she's not really a fan of. There are people in that community that they don't like, but they're part of this ecosystem and they figure it out and still work together despite not being particularly fond of each other. So for me, that's an important lesson about what kind of world we're going to be creating, that isn't one where we get to just isolate ourselves from the people we don't like. We have to figure out how to relate to them. And the police as a force are not actually useful or integral in that process at all. And the way that private policing looks may not look as familiar in the context of the United States, but I do think that model is something that we see in other countries and other places currently. This idea that the police understand themselves to be for the wealthy and not for people who are citizens. And again, who counts as a citizen? Only those folks with money, only those folks who can buy their way into Olivar or excel their way into Olivar, depending on their expertise, what kind of educational privilege they have.
And I agree with you, Moya. And even in the United States, even though it's more the subtext, because if we're paying taxes, ostensibly we're paying for the police and they belong to all of us. A lot of us know, not so much,
Absolutely.
that
Absolutely.
you might be at risk yourself if you are of color or marginalized or have mental health issues. If you call the police, if you're homeless, the police are certainly not working for you. And I think that it's beginning to jump out more as we see that, that this has been true, that disconnect between policing and the way it's been portrayed since the beginning of media, or certainly since the radio era with Dragnet on to the present. This idea of that protect and serve all citizens is starting to crumble a bit in people's minds as we start to see what's real.
Absolutely.
So true.
I guess I'm thinking of two more questions that we have that are kind of fun ones. We had, and we haven't talked about this nearly as much as we could. We got to do this more in the next upcoming webinars. And that is about Lauren as queer, right? And the ways in which she plays with gender and experiences sexuality, and how we teach this, or how this arises and what this can tell us. I'd love to hear some of our reflections on that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that my students bring up is just the fact that masculinity is protection. So when we see Lauren on the road, her decision to move through these places as a man because it's safer that way is something my students were really keen on, because again, that in the novel, but also in our everyday life, we do see that masculinity can be a form of protection, that women, feminine people are much more vulnerable. And we can see that manifesting also in terms of the experiences that Lauren's brother has when we look at Parable of the Talents. You know, his early life separated from Lauren, who, when he does survive, unbeknownst to her, included sexual violence because he was this very pretty, attractive, feminine person. So I do think that there's something to be unpacked there, and Octavia is again very, very astutely drawing to our attention the ways that certain people are made vulnerable because of their gender and their expression. And Lauren trying to navigate away from that, I think it is more, to me, in terms of how it's presented, is more about like survival than it is about kind of self-expression in that way. Although when we look at, we get less of a description of like how Lauren is dressing or feeling once we're in Earthseed. So I'd also be curious to know, like, is Lauren still rocking, you know, her oversized clothes when she's feeling comfortable and free in Earthseed with her baby and her partner?
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, because you're so right, Moya. I mean, from the very beginning, when she's like, when I go out there, I'm going out there like I'm going to be dressed like a man, right? Like that's part of my strategy. One of the things that I think my students point out is her comfort with sex and sexuality as a teenager, right? And it's not coerced, and it's just taken for granted, and she enjoys this, she owns it, and that's something I think that stands out and is quite noticeable in the early parts of the novel.
And I was thinking about what you said as masculinity as protection. And to me, as soon as you said it, I heard it. And I think I always read it as her warrior mode, right? And I think about Oya, who, as an Orisha in traditional Yoruba religion, there's a story about how Oya dresses as a man when she has to go deal with these men and protect women who have experienced violence. And that's how she goes into the marketplace, not as woman Oya, right, but as a male, as a man, so she can like handle business, usually on the behalf of more vulnerable women. And so that's how I read Lauren too, right? Like, okay, I'm here to handle business for those who might be more vulnerable. And then I can do something else, and it doesn't make her not herself.
Mm-hmm.
And as you pointed out in an earlier webinar, Monica, that's Lauren's middle name, Moya, right. Isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
Moya.
Yeah.
Yeah. I always love the opportunity to like now say, okay, now we're going to talk about Oya. Tell you about Oya.
You know, like the whirlwind, like coming in like a storm.
Right.
Yeah. I go maybe near our last question, which is the one I think is hard. If you were just going to teach an excerpt, I know, a parable of the sower, right? We have so many people listening who can't teach the whole book for all types of curricular constraints. If you were just going to teach part of it, I know it just breaks your heart. What would it be if you could only teach an excerpt, or if you had to select something?
I'm going to totally cheat on this answer. I would teach the Earthseed verses. I know, it's a cheat.
Me too.
Not an excerpt of but I mean, it's so difficult, you know. Every section of this novel is so rich and resonates so much with the Earthseed passages as it unfolds. I mean, you could begin when you're trying to warn others that trouble is coming. You could begin when the father has disappeared. You could begin with the attack on Robledo. You could begin with gathering your earth seed on the road. There are just so many elements, but I think it's the verses themselves that if you were going to hear nothing else about this novel as it relates to US history specifically, I think was the question, it would be the earth seed passages.
I was going to say the earthseed passages. That so it's a cheat, but it's an excerpt, right? And that you can get through the whole thing to watch it, how things develop and what the vision is. So that was my first choice. And then I think it's chapter 24, just because I love this line that I'll read. It's when Lauren is hugging, I can't remember who she's hugging, but it's toward the end, and she says that hug is sort of, what she's saying in that hug is, in spite of your loss and pain, you aren't alone. You still have people who care about you and want you to be all right. You still have family. Mm-hmm. And I thought that's, that just moves me so much, because that's what community is, right? Without even saying it, that you are not alone. So I would want, if I could only give students one thing, that would be the one thing. But yeah, the earthseed, sacred text, that's what I
Oh, this is so hard. I think actually I would, if you were just going to do an excerpt, I would probably do the part before the community collapses. So before we get on the road, when Lauren is still kind of percolating on Earthseed is emerging in her consciousness, and we're getting to know the world as it exists, and seeing all of those little fractures, I think, are so important in terms of how we understand humanity, what we assume to be the right way or the way things always were, our acceptance of the status quo, but also that tension and that pressure that things are going to shift is always there as well. So we see, even with the break-ins that start to happen in their gated community, Lauren's brother sneaking out and trying to figure out what's happening out in that world. I do think that there is a lot of potential there. Like, I think of from science and chemistry, like activation energy. It's like that moment before you go over the curve when they're on the road. So that might be what I would teach.
I think it might also be interesting to teach. I'm thinking of kind of this middle of the story, right? And I'm thinking of the fires and the fights, and kind of in the middle of gathering community, and what thinking of so often we find ourselves in the middle of our own stories, right? Where we're, so that might be kind of fun to teach as well, if I couldn't just do the Earthseed verses, in terms of saying, what if we just start right here and you see all the you're in the chaos, and we're seeing what the world is like. How does she manage that? Because I think right now we feel like we're in the chaos, and that's what we're asking ourselves. How are we managing it when we're in the middle of this chaos and it's unfolding around us with more and more uncertainty?
It's funny you asked that, Monica, because there's an Earthseed verse that addresses this very question. and for those of you who aren't as familiar with the Earthseed verses, maybe you haven't even read Parable yet, I just wanted to share one. It's one that doesn't get quoted that often. It's fairly lengthy, but bear with me. When a parent's stability disintegrates, as it must, God is change. People tend to give in to fear and depression, to need and greed. When no influence is strong enough to unify people, they divide, they struggle, one against one, group against group, for survival, position, power. They remember old hates and generate new ones. They create chaos and nurture it. They kill and kill and kill until they are exhausted and destroyed, until they are conquered by outside forces, or until one of them becomes a leader most will follow, or a tyrant most fear. No reason. Anyway, that's
or both.
or both.
We see leaders and tyrants.
Yes.
So that's how Octavia was dropping the knowledge in a parable.
In like 1990.
Way back.
Wow, 30 years. Wow. Yeah. I guess for us to be decent stewards of time, we might ask Dr. Coleman to come in and help us to wrap up.
Absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So this has been a wonderful conversation. As a person who's been sitting in the audience, I feel really privileged to be in this space, to listen to you all talk about tending to the spirit and the layered processes of and practices of healing through music and community and companionship and the chosen family that you find, or even the nature around you, you know, the living things that are in this world that you can connect to help you get through this difficult time with leaders and tyrants. So I do want to transition into making some space for our special guests to talk about the work that they're doing now that they want to share, and also talk about what's coming up next. So I guess I can start with Moya Bailey. Is there anything that you want to share about the work that you're doing now?
Sure. I'm working on a book on misogynoir and talking about its significance. So I do think that thinking about Octavia and the way that she addresses Black women's experiences is part of what I'm hoping to continue to look at in that work. And I'll be doing another talk on Monday night with some folks at Mount Holyoke for Say Her Name, to remember and it will be the 5-year anniversary of Sandra Bland's passing, and wanting to talk about just the experiences that Black women have had at the hands of police that often don't get told, because people sometimes forget that Black women are also disproportionately affected by police violence.
Thank you. That's important work. Thank you, Dr. Bailey. Dr. Griffin?
I'm working on a book that is a hybrid, part memoir and part mining the tradition of African American literature for what I think it has to teach the world all the time, but especially at this moment.
Awesome. Thank you. Dr. Coleman?
Wow, I can't wait for both of these books.
I'm saying, yeah.
The Octavia Tribe discount, right? No, we're so excited about them. Well, what I guess we are working on, even I wanted to share that we are 1 month into the workshops that we've started building around the fact that no one is coming to save us, right? And this is, I think, on the next slide, Dr. Coleman. So we have the Saving Ourselves, Shaping Change workshop, and it's already served to be a great community of folk, where we can interact a lot more than we can on the webinars. And so we're talking about 7 steps of Octavia's method of shaping change. We're getting to have ongoing conversations, and a bit of a social media group, so you can actually talk with other people and communicate and share really beautiful art people have been sharing. And there's still time to be a part of the community. And a bonus is to get to hear that interview that Tananarive often references, that the year 2000 interview she and Stephen did with Octavia Butler. That's a little bonus. So for more information, just go to, it's on the next slide, octaviawebinar.com is where you can sign up for the workshop. And we're really having a wonderful time in that community. So we're all about, no one's coming to save us. We're going to learn to save ourselves and do that together, so we don't feel like we're all out here just trying to hack at it from different corners.
Yes, we decided to create this additional community at www.octaviawebinar.com because we couldn't keep doing these particular webinars at the pace that we started. But we also don't want to leave the community hanging, because so many people are enjoying them and we're enjoying them, and we're brainstorming on our our own survival strategies that Octavia has inspired. So yes, absolutely come check us out. And one last thing, if I may, I don't know if my video is up,
Yeah, it's
but
Yeah.
but this is the Bloomsbury Handbook to Octavia E. Butler that was just published, I believe it was earlier this year, edited by, unfortunately, the late Dr. Gregory J. Hampton, who passed away unexpectedly, but also Dr. Kendra R. Parker. And for those of you who want to teach Octavia, there are a bunch of fantastic essays in here. So look out for the Bloomsbury Handbook to Octavia E. Butler. I
Is it
have
like
an
an early edition?
Yes.
Well,
Awesome. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Coleman.
I was going to say thank you. That's exactly what I was going to say. Thank you so much for
Thank everyone so much. This is just
joining us.
really, really great. If this is what we have to do to spend time with you, Moya, then we'll have to just do that. And also, so, just to visit with you all has been lovely, but to hear your insights is amazing. So thank you so much for coming.
Oh,
Thank
thank you
you.
for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you all for coming, all the panelists who were there. I mean, all the registrants.
Yeah.
My mama made it. Hi, Mama.
Better say hi to Mom.
Great. Well, thank you all. We'll sit tight while the tech does the thing that tech does.